When Dmitry Vasilev, Marina Colbert, and little Lucas left home, on that sunny morning of February 25th, 1994, no one imagined that it would be the last time the family would be seen alive. The sun was already rising strongly over the tree line. Streets of Casa Fort casting irregular shadows that danced between the century-old mango trees. The smell of burnt sugar and sugarcane juice mingled with the aroma of jasmine blooming in the backyards, while the distant sound of drums echoed from Olinda, calling the revelers to another day of celebration. Dmitry, a meticulous accountant, at one of the largest sugar and alcohol plants in Pernambuco, carefully locked the blue-painted wooden door of the house where they had lived for 8 years. Marina, a primary school teacher beloved by all the students at the neighborhood's municipal school, adjusted the floral dress she had chosen especially for Carnival. Little Luca, just 10 years old, was jumping up and down with excitement, holding in his hands a small yellow plastic trumpet he had received as a gift the previous Christmas. The Vasilev family was known throughout the neighborhood for their punctuality and organization. Dmitry, a descendant of Bulgarian immigrants who arrived in Brazil at the beginning of the century, maintained the same strict discipline he inherited from his grandparents. He woke up every day at 5 a.m., drank his black coffee without sugar, read the Pernambuco newspaper from the first to the last page, and walked to the bus stop with the punctuality of a Swiss watch. Marina, the daughter of a traditional family from Garanhans, brought to her marriage the sweetness of the Pernambuco countryside and a genuine love for children's education. She knew by name each of the 86 children who passed through her classroom. He kept the drawings he received as gifts and never lost his patience with any student during his 15 years of teaching. The couple met at a June festival in 1982 when Marina was still studying to be a teacher and Dmitry had just graduated in accounting from the Federal University of Pernambuco. The romance blossomed slowly, like the eye peas that grow in northeastern backyards. And 2 years later, they got married in a simple ceremony at the Carmo Church in the center of Recife. Luca was born in 1983, bringing a contagious joy to the house that until then had lived in the respectful silence of working adults. That Carnival morning, the family planned to follow the tradition of accompanying the Paidomera dos Quatro Cantos group, which would parade through the historic streets of Olinda. Dmitry had saved money for months so they could enjoy the 4 days of festivities without financial worries. Marina had prepared curd cheese sandwiches and bottles of ice water in a navy blue cooler bag. Luca hadn't been able to sleep well the night before. Such was the anticipation of seeing up close the giant puppets and the maracue that I admired so much on television. Around 8 a.m., the three walked towards the bus stop on Avenida Quexanga. Dmitry greeted his neighbors with discreet waves, who were also heading to the festivities. Marina stopped for a few moments to talk to Mrs. Esperanca, an 82-year-old woman who lived next door and always asked about Luca's academic progress. The boy ran ahead, imitating the steps of the little caboclinos he had seen at the dress rehearsal. The previous week, the bus that would take them to Olinda arrived on time. Dmitry paid for all 3 tickets. Marina chose seats near the window so that Luca could observe the landscape during the journey, and the family settled in among other revelers who were humming old marshes and talking about the groups they planned to follow that day. During the 40-minute journey, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Dmitry leafed through a notebook where he wrote down family expenses. Marina corrected some tests she had brought from home, and Luca drew giant dolls on a crumpled sheet of paper. They arrived in Olinda around 9:15. The streets were already bustling with activity, with street vendors offering cold beer, coconut water, and meat skewers. The trio walked along Rua do Amparo, admiring the colonial architecture that had withstood the test of time and urban transformations. Marina stopped on several occasions to photograph Luca next to the colorful mansions, using a simple camera that Dmitri had bought the previous year. Around 10 a.m., they found the Pitomera group from the Four Corners gathering on the slope leading to the Say Church. The crowd was impressive. Thousands of people dressed in improvised costumes. There, faces painted, children on their parents' shoulders, elderly people sitting on the sidewalks watching the movement. Dmitri bought 3 beers for the adults and a guarana soda for Luca. Marina tied a colorful scarf around her head to protect herself from the increasingly strong sun. For the next 2 hours, the family followed the Bloco through the streets of Olinda, singing, dancing, and socializing with strangers who became instant friends in the magic of Carnival. Luca received a green streamer from a lady dressed as a Bahian woman. Marina was invited to dance by a group of university students, and Dmitri, normally shy and reserved, surprised his wife by singing a march he had learned as a child. Around noon, when the sun reached its highest point and the heat became almost unbearable, the family decided to take a break. They sat in the shade of a leafy tree near the top of the cathedral. They ate the sandwiches Marina had prepared and drank ice-cold water. Luca fell asleep leaning on his mother's lap, exhausted from the morning of partying and walking. Dmitri took advantage of the quiet moment to check the bus schedules back home. It was at this moment that Teodoro Kravinsky appeared for the first time, a tall, thin man, approximately 40 years old, with visible scars on his face and a disturbing look in his eyes. He approached the family with the excuse of asking for directions to the cultural center, but Marina immediately noticed that something was not right. The man spoke with a foreign accent, fidgeted with his hands nervously, and his eyes seemed to study the family's every move. Dmitri, always polite, gave the requested information, but asked Teodoro to step aside when he noticed that the stranger continued to observe Marina and Luca with inappropriate insistence. Teodoro moved away, but did not disappear completely. All afternoon, Marina had the impression that they were being followed. Every now and then, she would spot the man's tall silhouette among the crowd, always keeping a safe distance, but never losing sight of the family. Dmitri, initially skeptical of his wife's concerns, began to share the same uneasiness when he himself noticed the stranger's constant presence. Around 3 p.m., when the family decided to return home, Teodoro made a new approach. This time he didn't ask for directions. He simply approached Dmitri and whispered something in his ear that made the accountant's face instantly pale. Marina, holding Luca's hand, couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see that her husband was visibly shaken. When she asked what had happened, Dmitri simply replied that they needed to leave immediately. The ride to the bus stop was tense and silent. Dmitri walked at a brisk pace, constantly looking over his shoulder. Marina carried Luca in her arms, as the boy complained that his legs were hurting. At every corner, she had the feeling that Teodoro might appear again, but the mysterious man seemed to have disappeared into the colorful carnival crowd. They arrived at the bus stop around 3:40. There was a considerable line of people waiting for transport back to Recife, all tired and sweaty after a full day of partying. Dmitri bought mints from a street vendor and tried to distract Luca with simple games, but Marina noticed that he remained nervous and distracted. When she pressed to know what Teodoro had said, Dmitri simply murmured that it was work matters, and that they would discuss it at home. A bus arrived at 4:10. The family managed to get seats in the back of the vehicle. On the way back, Luca fell asleep again, this time leaning on his father's shoulder. Marina watched the landscape through the window, but her thoughts were focused on her husband's strange behavior. Dmitri remained silent throughout the journey, fiddling nervously with a crumpled piece of paper that he took out and put back in his shirt pocket every few minutes. They got off the bus on Avenida Caxanga at 5:05 in the afternoon. The sun was already beginning to set, casting a golden light over the tree-lined streets of Casafort. Some houses already had their lights on, and the smell of dinner being prepared began to spread through the neighborhood. The family walked toward their street, greeting neighbors returning from their own carnival outings. It was at this moment that Teodoro appeared for the third and final time. He was standing on the corner of the street where they lived, as if he was waiting for them. This time he didn't approach the family. He just nodded towards Dmitri, who stopped abruptly on the sidewalk. Marina noticed that her husband was shaking slightly, but when she asked if everything was okay, he forced a smile and said he was just tired. They entered the house at 5:15 in the afternoon. Dmitri locked the door more carefully than usual, testing twice to see if the lock had worked properly. Marina prepared a warm bath for Luca, who was covered in glitter and sweat after the day of partying. While the boy bathed, she organized his dirty clothes in a basket and began to prepare a simple dinner: rice, beans, shredded chicken, and farifa. During dinner, Dmitri remained silent, picking at his food with his fork, but eating very little. Luca, excited, told us about everything he had seen during the day. The giant dolls, the drums, the colorful costumes, the games with other children. Marina smiled and asked questions to encourage her son to talk, but she couldn't shake her concern about her husband's increasingly strange behavior. After dinner, while Marina washed the dishes and Luca watched television in the living room, Dmitri asked to talk alone in the bedroom. It was then that he revealed the terrifying truth about his encounter with Teodoro Kravinsky. A man was not a lost tourist, but rather an agent of a criminal organization that was beginning to establish itself in Recife, taking advantage of the growing urban disorganization and police corruption that characterized that era. Dmitri confessed that he had discovered serious irregularities in the accounting of the plant where he worked. Falsified documents, embezzled money, ghost accounts that moved millions of dollars without justification. When he tried to report these findings to the company owner, he was threatened and told to forget everything he had seen. Frightened, but driven by ethical principles he had inherited from his family, Dmitri decided to go to the federal police to report the scheme. Teodoro Kravinsky was in charge of solving the problem represented by the honest accountant. During the meeting in Olinda, he offered two alternatives to Dmitri: accept a sum of money to keep quiet permanently, or face the consequences that would affect not only him, but also his family. The paper Dmitri was fiddling with nervously in his pocket on the way back contained an address and a time. He was to attend a meeting alone the next day to give his final answer. Marina was terrified by the revelation. He suggested that they immediately contact the police, leave the city, and ask relatives in the countryside for help. Dmitri, however, believed that any attempt to escape would only confirm his guilt in the eyes of the criminals and make the situation even more dangerous for the family. He decided to attend the scheduled meeting, hoping to negotiate some kind of agreement that would guarantee Marina and Luca's safety. The next morning, February 26th, Dmitri left home at 7 a.m., telling his wife he would return before lunch. Marina stayed home with Luca, who woke up complaining of a headache and low-grade fever, likely a result of excessive sun exposure the day before. She prepared lemon balm tea, gave him medicine to reduce his fever, and called the school to let him know she wouldn't be at work that day. The hours dragged by slowly. Marina tried to distract herself with household chores, but her mind was completely focused on worrying about her husband. Noon came and went with no news of Dmitri. 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m. Around 4 p.m., Marina could no longer contain her anxiety. She called the plant where her husband worked, but was informed that he had not shown up for work that day. At 5 p.m., when Dmitri was supposed to be arriving home, Marina decided to go out and look for him. She left Luca in the care of Donna Esperanca, the elderly neighbor, and walked to the address she had written down on the crumpled piece of paper her husband carried in his pocket. It was an abandoned warehouse in the Maddalena neighborhood, near the port of Recife. The place was deserted and silent. Marina knocked on the rusty metal door, shouted her husband's name, but got no response. Decided to return home and wait, hoping that Dimitri would appear with some plausible explanation for the delay. However, when he arrived home, he found Donna Esperanca in a panic. 2 men had taken Luca away, saying that Marina was waiting for them at a certain address. From that moment on, Marina understood that she had fallen into a carefully planned trap. The criminals had no intention of negotiating with Dimitri. They wanted to eliminate the entire family to ensure that the secret about the corruption scheme would never come to light. She ran back to Maddalena's shed, this time accompanied by Donna Esperanca and 2 neighbors who offered to help. They found the shed with the door ajar. In the dark, dusty interior, there were obvious signs of violence. Blood stains on the cement floor, broken chairs, pieces of rope. On a makeshift table, they found the documents that Dimitri had copied from the plant, now torn and partially burned. There was, however, no sign of the Vasilev family. Police were called immediately, but the initial investigation was hampered by a lack of witnesses and the destruction of evidence. The case was initially treated as a kidnapping, then as a possible homicide, but without bodies or reliable witnesses, little progress was made. Years passed, and the mystery of the disappearance of the Vilev family became one of the most talked about and disturbing stories in Casafort. If you're enjoying this mystery, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to discover more intriguing cases like this. The clues are piling up, but the mystery remains. If you're trying to solve this case with me, leave your theory in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. 12 years have passed. Carnival was once again celebrated with the same joy and intensity, but the name of the Vasilevi family continued to be whispered through the streets of Casafort whenever February approached. Many theories have emerged over the years. Some believed they had managed to escape and were living in another country. Others suspected that they had been killed and their bodies thrown into the Capibara River. There were still those who argued that it was all just an elaborate setup to escape debts or unknown personal problems. The house where the family lived was sold by Marina's relatives 3 years after her disappearance. The new owners, a young couple with 2 young children, reported strange events during the first few months. Unexplained noises during the early hours of the morning, objects moving around, the constant feeling of being watched. Although they didn't believe in ghosts, they ended up moving out after 6 months, saying the house didn't bring peace to the family. It was then that Antonio Bergolit, the neighbor who lived 3 houses away, went to the police station in March 2006. Bergolit, a descendant of Croatian immigrants, had been the only neighbor who kept his distance from the initial investigation, claiming not to have seen or heard anything suspicious at the time of the disappearance. For 12 years, he kept a secret that gnawed at his conscience and disturbed his sleep. On the afternoon of February 26, 1994, while watering the plants in his backyard, Antonio heard muffled screams coming from the Vasilev's house. Initially, he thought it could be a family argument or even a joke between Marina and Luca. But when the screams became more desperate and were followed by a sudden, disturbing silence, he realized something terrible was happening. Antonio cautiously approached the wall that separated the 2 properties and managed to see through a gap in the wooden fence. Saw 2 men he didn't recognize dragging heavy objects wrapped in dark tarps from the Vasilev's house to a black pickup truck parked on the street. One of the men was tall and thin, with scars on his face. It exactly matched the description of Teodoro Kravinsky, which would later be provided by the police investigation. The neighbor admitted that he was paralyzed by fear. The men moved with military efficiency. They were constantly checking to see if they were being watched, and one of them carried a visible gun on his waist. Antonio knew that if he were discovered spying, he would probably be executed on the spot. He decided to hide inside his own house and wait for the criminals to leave. At around 6 p.m., the truck left in an unknown direction. Antonio waited another 2 hours before venturing into the backyard again. The Vasilev's house was completely silent, with all the windows closed and no sign of life. He considered checking on the family, but fear of the consequences paralyzed him again. During the following days, as the police began their investigation and neighbors were questioned, Antonio deliberately lied. He said he had spent the whole afternoon inside his house watching television, and that he hadn't noticed anything in common. Justified his decision to remain silent by claiming that he feared for the safety of his own family. He had a wife and 3 young children and could not risk their lives to testify about a crime that had already been committed. The secret gnawed at Antonio Bergovit for 12 years. He developed chronic insomnia, began drinking excessively, and became paranoid and suspicious. His wife did not understand the radical change in behavior, and the marriage began to deteriorate. The children grew up in a tense and unstable environment, without understanding why their father had become a bitter and tormented person. In 2005, Antonio suffered a mild heart attack that almost resulted in death. It was while recovering in the hospital that he finally decided to confess the truth. He spoke first to a priest, then to his wife, and finally to the police authorities. He knew that his belated confession could result in legal consequences, but he could no longer bear the weight of guilt and silence. Antonio Bergovit's confession allowed the police to reconstruct the events of February 26, 1994. Dmitry Vasilev had been executed in the Madalena warehouse during the morning, probably tortured to reveal whether he had copied the compromising documents or told others about the scheme. Marina and Luca were murdered at home during the afternoon, when the criminals concluded that it was necessary to eliminate the entire family to ensure absolute silence. The bodies were never found, but the investigation indicated that they were likely dissolved in acid or cremated in industrial ovens controlled by the criminal organization. Teodoro Kravinsky had left Brazil a few days after the murders and was never located by the authorities again. Other members of the gang were identified and some arrested, but the main physical evidence of the crime had been destroyed more than a decade ago. The revelation devastated the Cassaforte community. Family and friends of the Vasilevs, who had spent 12 years waiting for news or hoping for a reunion, were faced with the brutal reality that Dmitry, Marina, and Luca had been coldly murdered by criminals who would never be adequately punished. The family name, once remembered with fondness and longing, became associated with a tragedy that could have been avoided if authorities had paid more attention to signs of corruption at the time. Donna Esperanca, the elderly neighbor who had cared for Luca in the last hours of his life, died 6 months after Antonio's confession, apparently unable to bear the weight of the truth. Marina's co-workers organized a memorial service at the school where she taught, but many parents opposed it, arguing that they did not want their children associated with such a violent and disturbing history. The house where the family lived was demolished in 2007. A small garden was built on its site with a discreet plaque commemorating the victims of urban violence. Many residents of Cassaforte, however, avoid passing through the area, especially during Carnival, when the contrast between the joy of the streets and the tragedy of memory becomes unbearable. Antonio Bergovit served a 2-year prison sentence for failure to provide assistance and false testimony. After his release, he moved with his family to another city, trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered by the weight of silence. He remains the only living witness to the Vasilev family's final moments carrying a guilt that will never be completely forgiven or forgotten. And so another mystery is solved. If you manage to discover the truth before the revelation, tell us in the comments. If you liked this story, click like right where you're listening to us from, and subscribe to the channel by activating the bell. See you in the next mystery on our channel.